been um, doing this kind of RJ work really since 2013. I really got invested in it while I was working on my dissertation, or actually before I got on my dissertation, I ended up switching my dissertation to be about restorative justice as a result of learning more about it and getting connected to the ideals and the principles, because I really recognized and it resonated with me that perhaps what we were doing wasn't as effective as it could be. And I really wanted to make sure that I could find some new pathways to kind of address the things that I was witnessing as someone working on campus, and especially as I was going to be moving up into more administrative roles in higher education. And thus my dissertation was born, and thus the book chapter that I wrote, and another book chapter that will be coming out later. And so I'm really just excited to be with you all here. So, but I want to know kind of who's in the room. So if you don't mind, go ahead and type in your name and kind of what your position is at the institution. If you're a student or student leader, if you're an administrator, who's all in the room? And again, you don't have to participate, but if you would like to, please do so. And consent using the chat box. Awesome, thank you. So as we're really going to be diving into this a bit more, share what you're hoping to learn and gain from our time here today. What you want to make sure that I'm covering in the next 30 minutes or so. You can also unmute yourself and speak if you would like. The benefits of restorative justice when compared to other avenues. Okay. How to approach the conflict through the framework. Glad you used the word framework there. Learn about RJ and how you can incorporate it into day-to-day practices. What exactly restorative justice is and how to implement it at Helmton. Great, thank you. Oh, I see something in the chat box as well. Hope you're learning the most you can about restorative justice and unlearn myths. Okay, great. Participants to gain foundation understanding. Good, good. So hopefully I should be covering kind of all of that. And keeping in mind that I will not be able to cover every possible thing that you would need to know about restorative justice in this amount of time. This is really about an overview, but I'm also more than happy to kind of engage with people individually after the fact. But I'll also be back in like a week and a half to, I don't know, time is distorted for me, to do some circle work with you all. So what exactly kind of is restorative justice? Well, what you probably have heard broadly is that it is something that is adapted from kind of some indigenous practices. And while that is true, I really want to emphasize that restorative justice is not aiming to kind of perform indigeneity, right? Indigenous practices, but rather that it's trying to pull from the roots, right? The values that are rooted in those indigenous practices, which is really about seeing one another as humans who are worthy of respect and understanding, and how we can get back to developing a relationship, right? Thinking about what does it mean to be in community with another person, and thinking about the role that relationships have with how we kind of connect or disconnected from one another, and then how do we repair those, right? So it's a process that it's about involving all of our stakeholders, so everyone who might be involved in the process, so the person who's been impacted, the person who's caused harm, their support systems, community individuals who might be involved, secondary targets perhaps, so people who are not immediately impacted but might be impacted as a result of kind of ongoing conflict, etc. And I think the other part here, right, is that restorative justice looks at offenses not as a single event, but contextual consequences to deeper systemic issues, right? So again, it's thinking about where does harm come from and how do we address that root cause of that harm to reduce someone's likelihood to repeat that harm again in the future. And don't worry about like, well, one, this is recorded, but I will also give you all access to the slides after the fact as well. So don't worry about the fact that I won't be reading every single thing on the slide. So for you, I want you to answer what restorative justice is. What? A revival of community-based justice, engaging people in inclusive and collaborative decision making, emphasizes accountability and repair, or all of the above. Right, so it's all of the above, right? So it's really thinking about, again, as I just mentioned, right, this idea of community-based justice. So how are all of us impacted and how are all of us going to be involved in the process of amending what just happened, right? It's the collaborative process. So no individual person is making the decision on how best to solve the problem, right? And then this idea of accountability is really shifting this nature, right? From the state perspective, when we think about justice, it is someone else who's determining your fault, right? You may have admitted guilt, but sometimes that's not a result of you actually being guilty. It might be just a result of not wanting to perhaps getting longer sentence. And then someone is deciding what your punishment will be, right? No, the people involved are generally the people impacted and the person who was causing harm are not really involved in that process. Where this is flipping that on its head and saying, what do we need to do collectively to decide how we're going to make amends, right? How we're going to repair that harm. And so what I really like to emphasize when I'm thinking talking about restorative justice is that restorative justice is not something that you do, right? It's something that is, right? It's a way of being. It is a process that encompasses a number of different elements, right? So it's broadly speaking, it is an ethical framework. It's a framework for existing, right? So there's many different elements that exist that I would call like restorative practices, but for restorative justice part to really happen, right, there's a number of different things that have to happen. So we're really thinking about how do we create positive, equitable, and just relationships. We're really thinking about how are we building people's capacity to develop empathy and care. We're really thinking about what does it mean to be accountable for the actions you've caused, and then how do you resolve that through the obligations and who's obligated to make those amends, right? And then thinking about like even for the person who's caused harm, right, there's still some mutual recognition and dignity that should still be there. And through that support, right, we see change happening. Right, so as I just mentioned, and I'm not going to go over this too much, but right, we think about restorative practices versus restorative justice. We have these different pieces that kind of happen, and that can happen separately, but when all together, right, we see this and happen. Restorative justice is when we see victim reparation, offender accountability or responsibility, and community reconciliation all happening together. That's where the restorative justice part happens. But more so, I think a better description of restorative justice is this kind of tree model. Right, so you're looking at the bottom, the roots of the tree is really the core assumptions, right? That humans are good, they're wise and powerful, and they're interconnected, right? We're gifted, we're capable, we're holistic. And through that, like if we're building off of that assumption, right, that humans are good, don't get me wrong, humans do awful things, but generally speaking, humans are good, right? They're taught to do things, or they're doing things out of harm that was caused to them. Then we lead into like kind of the trunk, right? So kind of our own intersectional identities and self-work that we have to do for our care. We're thinking about how we can be trauma informed, right? We're building relationships through community building circles and processes. And then we're leading over to the branches, right? So we're actually engaging in what we consider like the practice of RJ, of restorative justice. So doing conversations, doing circles, doing community building. So engaging in restorative language, those types of things. And then the fruits and leaves are the outcomes, right? So the actual accountability part of it, the repairing of the harm, the healing of relationships. Now I say repairing of harm and healing of relationships, and I think that those terms can be very weighted, in that I think people, there's not really full ways to like repair harm, right? Because it's the same way you think about like a cracking of a cup, right? It's not going to be fully fixed together, but it will be mended enough that you can kind of move forward with your progress or move forward with your relationship, even though there might still be some cracks and some slivers still there. So when we think about how it needs to be approached, on any given campus, right? We look at this kind of whole campus approach. And you look at this pyramid, you'll see it kind of, these 3 tiers. And you'll notice the biggest tier here is the community building part, right? The building of relationships. And the reason for that is I won't feel the need to repair harm, right? If I'm a person who's caused harm, if I don't actually have a relationship with the individual who I've harmed. I don't necessarily see them as a person who I connect to. So if I've caused them harm, I may not feel the need to make amends because who are you to me? And in the same way, if I'm the person who was harmed, who are you to me? I don't really care about your apology because I don't actually have a relationship with you, right? Or I don't really care about your healing that you need to do so that you don't repeat the harm in the future, because who are you to me? So really, we have to spend a lot of time, and the majority of the work when we talk about kind of restorative practices is in this area of community building, right? Thinking about how do we build relationships? How do we get people to develop empathy and care for the people around them? How do we get people to see another person as an actual human? Which seems like that's the thing we should all be doing, but we know through history that that's not always been the case. So how do we really spend that time developing relationships with each other that, one, we're less likely to want to cause harm to people we have now built relationships with. 2, if I do cause harm, I'm more likely to want to make amends for the harm that I have caused. And then 3, I'm more willing to embrace the person who's caused me harm because I want to be part of their healing so that they're not harming myself in the future or other people, right? So you've got to spend a lot of time really in that kind of core piece down there. And then tier 2 is really exactly responding to a specific incident. So if you're really doing that bottom tier right really well, then moving into tier 2 is easier. 1, because people have gotten used to being in the practice of being in circle and talking, right? Or talking about themselves, talking about the things where they've been impacted by the people around them, right? So you can actually get to a place where people feel comfortable and buy into the process of like being in a community conference or being in a circle process to do that. And then that tier 3, which I would say most schools are not doing a lot of, but it's kind of that re-entry. So how do we welcome a person back into the community? And I think about that in terms of like, again, if I'm a person who has caused harm, think about your own family. If your family members are just telling you need to get out, you need to leave, then even if I want to make amends, why would I? Because you've already told me I'm not welcome here anymore. You've already told me that even if I try to come back, I'm not a part of this community anymore. So my motivation, if you will, to kind of participate or to make those amends, even if I do really want to do it, is kind of null and void. So how do we bring people back into the communities with the support and making sure that they're committed to doing what they said they're going to do, that the people who they have impacted feel comfortable with them returning to the community, and that they have a support system as they're coming back. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but if you look at these are types of questions that we would use for those different tiers. So the community building really, again, is about who are we? Who are we in relationship to one another? Why is this important? What are our values, and how do our values impact how we relate to other people, right? Tier 2 is really specific about that. Who was harmed? How are you impacted by that harm? What do we need to do to get it right? And then in tier 3, it's kind of like, how can we support you in your return? What responsibility have you taken? What steps have you taken to kind of make amends? Have you actually done those steps? And then what will you, how are you committed to not doing this again? And what are you committing to make sure that you won't do it again in the future? So how and who benefits from restorative justice? Oh, there we go. you have a question up on your screen. Oh, rude. So why do people cause harm? Is it a response to an unmet need or expectations? As a response, a reproduction of harm caused to them. They don't feel others' pain. They enjoy feeling others' pain, or they see others as a threat. Yeah. So it's all of them, really. And granted, the last three, generally speaking, would be partly, particularly the two that they don't feel others' pain and they feel others' pain is psychopathic behavior, but that still cause harm, right? So I see, hold on, as a reproduction of harm caused. No, so it's a reproduction of harm caused to them. So they're reproducing the harm that has been inflicted on them onto other people, right? So I carry trauma perhaps from harm that was done to me, and I reproduce that same kind of trauma and harm onto others, even people I say I care about, right? So that's what I mean by the reproduction of harm caused to them, right? But yeah, but primarily, particularly for those people who are doing harm, perhaps not in an intentional way, are doing it as a response to an unmet need or expectations that they have set out that were not met for them, or it's a reproduction of harm caused to them. So when we think about our justice systems that have tried to resolve that, what ends up happening, right? The unmet need is never met, right? The addressing of what caused them harm that they're now responding to is never met. So we really have to spend some time reimagining what does justice look like? What does punishment look like? What does accountability look like? Because right now, if we think about, so I know Alma was talking earlier before we started about like really being passionate about criminal justice systems. We think about our current systems. Where are we doing some of that unpacking? Where are people unlearning what caused them harm so that they won't then repeat that harm in the future? What in our processes is talking about, right, meeting some unmet needs? Yeah, so when they say they don't feel pain, do you mean they lack empathy? Yeah, to a degree. So they're not able to empathize with the pain of other people. And that's what I was talking about, that could be a sign of psychopathic behavior. Right, so that's, again, that's partly why part of this work, restorative processes, is about the relationship building processes so that people can develop empathy for those around them, for people who are in their sphere, and then hopefully then being able to apply that to people outside of their own social circles and spheres. Right, but our current kind of processes really focus on it, kind of here, this like accountability, but without the support part of it. And what does that accountability kind of end up looking like? It ends up looking like long sentences in which people are isolated away from the people who do provide them support and care, and who perhaps actually do have empathy for them, and they're placed into a system where the people around them then don't care about them, don't have empathy for them, don't care about their rehabilitation, don't care about why they caused harm in the first place. They're not unlearning anything about the bad behavior, the things that they did that got them into that situation. And then when they come back out, they're doing the same things all over again because we don't have a system set up to really welcome people back out from our traditional criminal justice systems. But then even in our kind of in higher ed, we just often shift people from one school to another. So you get removed from this school and you go to another school, but you didn't really unlearn why what you did was a problem. And so now you're at a different institution repeating that same harm, right? It's there all over again, right? Or perhaps you learn a little something, but you didn't really unpack that, right? You didn't spend some time really even talking to the person who was impacted. So you didn't really learn that it's impact. Someone told you what you did was bad, and you go, yeah, sure, that was bad. But you didn't really develop an understanding of why it was so harmful, because you didn't really have to spend time engaging with the person who was impacted. You didn't have to hear their story. You didn't have to see their pain. You just kind of were like, someone's like, yeah, what you did, you were found responsible. And then a punishment was handed to you. And then you go and you do that thing, and then you're done. But even for people who really do feel it and they're like, I deeply recognize how I've impacted another person, the way that our systems are set up for in a lot of spaces don't allow that person to actually make amends, right? Because I often no contact directives, or we've not really set up a culture where we apologize. So even if I wanted to make amends to a person, how will I step to this individual to say, I recognize the impact I've caused to you, and I want to make amends for that. We've not created a culture where that actually happens. And so restorative processes is creating a culture where that can happen, where we can do that part of that work. And so when we talk again about the difference between kind of punitive spaces and restorative spaces, and there are ways in which, not really that they can cohabitate, but kind of that they can work together, ways that you can embed restorative processes into your existing stuff. But I think for restorative work to really be its most impactful, you almost have to kind of get rid of kind of our traditional punitive pathways. But the reality is that that's just not going to happen anytime soon. So there are ways that we can blend those together, and I'll talk a little about that later. But so just looking at these different types of questions, right, between punitive and restorative. So punitive really is kind of like the who did it, right, or what law did you break, right? And sometimes if we recognize like morality and legality are not, they don't go hand in hand. So there are things that a person could do that would be legal, but would severely have impact on a person, and and the other way around. So really asking that question of what happened. One, it's already kind of giving person kind of permission to just kind of share their story without already feeling accused. Right, so they're more open to kind of sharing, and then through that sharing they're able to kind of unpack and kind of like who was impacted and how were they impacted, what do you need to do to make amends, right? Do you recognize where you have harmed this other individual? Whereas if I'm already defensive from the beginning, I'm making excuses for everything that I did before I even try to explain it, because you've already put me up in arms, right? So just language. Harm and repair versus like crime and punishment. Victim perpetrator versus person who was harmed, person who caused harm, right? The motivation, relationship based versus fear and control based, right? So you see these types of differences that are here. I think this should be part of growing up. This is now how things were when yeah. Right, so when you think about justice, what are the things that you need, right? Or things that you wish, if you've experienced, a conduct process or, the criminal justice system, what are the things that you wish you had experienced that would make you feel healed, or that justice was actually done for you in that process? What would you want to know? What would you have wanted to happen for justice to have happened for you? Or if you haven't experienced, just thinking about what you know, what do you need? What do you think you need? Acknowledgement, ending of cycles. Not very much, I think. Advocacy and action from those with greater decision-making power, being heard, earnest apology, that the individuals who caused harm listened and understood the impact of the harm, acknowledgement that what they did was wrong, apology, and effort to do right by me. Yeah, right? So, but when you think about our kind of current systems, there's not really an acknowledgement of what was done. There's no apology because, again, someone else has decided that that person was responsible or guilty. They've not owned that. They've not taken accountability. Someone has decided that they were accountable, that they were responsible, and then someone else decides what that outcome should be as a result of that. And the person who's impacted never actually sees that the person understands the harm that was caused, right? Or that they won't do it again, etc. Right? So acknowledgement seems to be like a really big part of what we think about in terms of accountability and justice. So when we talk about then what restorative justice offers then, right, again, so it's seeking to address the root cause. So yeah, in a way, intent versus impact. So yes, impact is more important than intent, but it's also important to recognize the intent, because through that unpacking of the intent for the person who's caused harm, we get to do some of that. They can do some of that unlearning, so they can really understand how, regardless of their intent, the impact was still there, and also recognizing the root cause, right? It gives the person who's caused harm an opportunity to correct some wrongs, which again, in some of our other processes, they don't actually really get to do that, right? That accountability with support. And then for the person who's been harmed, they get their questions answered. So why did you choose me? Why was I the person who was impacted? Like, will you commit this harm again? But beyond that, right, we think about meeting harmed parties' needs. So sense of safety and care, support and education, grieving and expression, voice and empowerment, being believed, right, vindicated, right? So this information, options, choices. I think a lot of our processes prevent people from wanting to participate because they actually don't want the other person perhaps to like get in trouble. They don't want that person to have to be removed from the community, or, you know, they're worried about how their friend circle will react if this person, you know, gets in trouble. So the way that our, you know, in some processes, that person would have to be removed, right? That's the minimum requirement. But in this process, there might be a way where that person can, the feelings can be acknowledged, the wrongdoing can be acknowledged, a commitment can be made to not doing it again, and they don't have to be removed from that community. They can still have that support system that's there. Right, and so then when we think about the types of harms that exist, often we put them in generally 4 categories, right? The emotional and spiritual, which is where we often spend a lot of time, and a number of things where people want that acknowledgement. They want to make sure, like, yes, that did happen, right? So you acknowledge that you did this thing, correct? Okay, great, thank you. It wasn't all in my head. Someone else acknowledges it and recognizes it. And then there's material and physical harm, right? So, you know, that could be money, it could be body damage to the body, recognizing that communal relationships. So tear of relationships. I no longer trust you. The community no longer trusts you. So how do we repair that? And then the inflamed structural and historical, so thinking about issues of racism, sexual violence, those types of things there. So when we think about how we would address those, right? So the acknowledgement, apology, repair, restitution, recovery, community service, reintegration, social justice system change. And so when we think about then where this idea of being able to embed kind of restorative processes into your existing practices, these are some of the things that happen. One is the shifting of your language. So start using restorative questions or affective statements in your existing policies or practices and group procedures in your, wherever things existing. So again, shifting from what did you do to like what happened, right? The affect, doing kind of check-ins. So I do, whenever I start my meetings, I always start at like kind of the check-ins, just getting people to know each other, getting comfortable around something as arbitrary. Actually, one of my favorite ones is asking people like, what is your name? And if you could change your name, why or why not? And so that, can go in a number of different directions depending upon who's in the space. So obviously for our individuals who are trans or non-binary who have chosen to change their name for a reason, or if I really want people to get emotional, I talk about the person who named me, who was murdered, right? And so like bringing up that emotional pain of this person who gifted me with my name, which by the way, Desiree is a great name, right? It's a great name. Or I could just say like it's kind of like French for like to be desired, like, right? Like I could, depending on where I want people to go, something as simple as like just tell me about your name. And I actually did this once with our campus police, and they don't like to share anything, but I just had them talk about this and I couldn't get them to stop talking, right? So it starts to get people to open up in ways that seem simple, but again are building relationships and connections, because people start to build off of the previous person's kind of question and statement. So ongoing community building circles, integrity boards, and then impromptu conferences based on kind of, or circles, depending upon like what's happening in your community at the time. And so when we talk about circles, which is I'm going to spend more time talking about that than I will about conferences, because again, I really think we want to spend most of our time there. You have kind of the 5 C's of circle. So the convening, so who's going to be together, how are we going to connect the group together to find some type of common connection? What are you talking about in that circle? So what is your concern? And concern doesn't necessarily be a negative thing, but like what is the topic of choice? the collaboration. Where are we kind of going together? How are we coming to some type of agreement as a collective group? And then how will we close out our circle together? So circle processes, again, I'm not going to go through all of this, right? It's a tool that facilitates kind of this equity of voices. So you sit in a circle to create what, a non-hierarchy in that space. You do have a facilitator, but really they're there to kind of coordinate the space, but really allowing the people in the room, in the circle, to kind of dictate where it goes and how it goes. Right. And so being able to use like the talking piece creates a system for being able to make sure that you feel like you can share completely without being interrupted, and also invites people to be able to really listen and listen deeply in this. I just realized a video got skipped, but that's okay. Fine. Right. And so, you set some ground rules, right? It's about kind of this shared leadership in this space. You're going to set some values and some guidelines, and you're coming to some type of consensus in that space, right? So those are kind of some of the elements of being in circle. I'm going to show a quick little bit of a video around some folks who did some circle work. And then we have like 2 more things, and then I'll open it up for questions. Maybe if it works.
But we live in a very individualistic society, and we don't think about other people as much as we should. So if we could just take the time every day to think, hey, how is Kristen doing? How's Adam doing? Or they look a little glum. Let's talk to them. I think that would go a long way in preventing, bullying, school shootings, and a lot of the adverse effects of social isolation and alienation.
So this semester, I took this course with David Karp at Skidmore College about restorative justice circles. And for a part of this class, my friend Ruby and I went down to South Glensfall High School, and we did community building circles there.
To me, restorative justice is all about listening and getting the chance to know the people around you better.
Having a deep conversation with someone is it's such a normal human thing that we've lost contact with.
I think a lot of the problems we have in schools have to deal with that sense of inclusion, that kids act out when they don't feel like they're listened to, or they don't feel like they belong, or they feel like who they are is not acceptable.
I was able to get out the things that I needed and take in also all the information that I needed. I learned respect for all the people in the circle, and I learned how to listen to people a little bit better.
So most circles start off with like an icebreaker or a check-in round. Like during our first week, we did that ball game. Something that's kind of like relatively low stakes, so that way if people want to interpret a question more deeply and answer it like really kind of in a vulnerable state, they can.
So actually, Sela makes me laugh all the time. I have a lot of classes with her, so I see her all the time, and we always laugh together, and she's a really cool person. Thank you.
What I realized the difference was with the talking piece being passed was that every person had an opportunity to have the floor and then decide whether or not they wanted to use it, instead of just being like, I gotta throw my hand up to get it, and I don't want everyone looking at me when it's just, now I have it and it's my decision. And that's something I think is an important differential. To have the power to speak, allow someone to make the call for themselves.
So after you have this sort of icebreaker or check-in round, how's your day, how are you feeling, you get into the topic that you want to talk about. For Ruby and I, we actually asked our students at the end of our first circle, what are the things you want to talk about? And they gave us a huge list of stuff that they wanted to discuss. So every time we went in, we came in with one of the topics that they wanted to talk about, that they told us about in the first week.
One week, we were planning on talking about how the students felt that their voices weren't heard by the administration, but then during that conversation, the subject of school shootings, safety, and youth suicide came up.
You
You don't have to be sorry. You're okay. Take your time.
We were Boy Scouts together for a very long time up until he took his life. And the day goes by where I don't miss him still.
We're not here to be therapists, right? These kids are in the circle to build community, not talk to us about their issues. One of the big things that we need to do by the end of circle is get them to collaborate, because it's not about them talking to us, it's about them talking to each other.
The latter half of the
So I show that video one because I talk about, again, like thinking about, right, the process. One, this is a group that is together frequently, right? And so they're building relationships over time. And so as you can kind of see in that video, I think that student wouldn't be probably in a place to feel vulnerable enough to share about their friend who took their own life if they didn't feel like they had the support and the community to kind of be together in that space. And so thinking again, right, and recognizing that the people that were going to be in the circle with them would be able to be that supportive voice with them, right, to be able to lend that voice, or for them to be able to share that voice comfortably and feel like they had people who would kind of be there for them, right? So thinking about how we build those relationships, and you can still do that in one session, right? You can cultivate your circle process so people get a little bit more vulnerable each time they share, and in a way, as a facilitator, you kind of also model that vulnerability. And sometimes you can strategically coordinate how people are seated in your circle to facilitate some of that vulnerability in that space. So you make sure that the people who are closest to the facilitator are the people who are most likely to kind of be open and share, because they were kind of set the standard for what everybody else will do, because they'll pick up off of what the kind of first people do and set as far as what they're going to be sharing. So those are just things to think about when we talk about like being in circle and circle processes. And then I spend a lot of time talking about conferences, because again, that's tier 2, and that's really thinking about the kind of how do we identify the specific harms, what are the specific needs then as a result of those harms, and then who's obligated to address those needs. And so you're going to be using those kind of restorative questions that are here in this image. So what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What did you realize? What happened? How's the impact impacted you, or how's the incident impacted you, right? Those are the types of things you'll be asking in those conferences, and that's going to be addressing a specific kind of incident, right? Whereas circles can kind of just be more broad. It can address kind of anything, but circles can also be used to address a particular incident, but it's going to be more kind of around a community base rather than it's going to be individual people who were impacted by that incident. Excuse me. Something is missing. What? Okay, my slides keep getting missing. Okay, so but when you're thinking about restorative justice, I think here the things that I always talk about are the challenges when implementing. There's not really a uniformity, right? There's not a particular like exact model that you can copy and take it to your institution to implement, right? And that's also the beauty of it, because you can really model around the needs of your specific community. You can fold it into kind of how your community operates and functions in order to make it work for you, but it also makes it really hard to kind of do some comparisons, because there is no singular kind of like X model that you follow. There are some particular elements that should be there consistently when you're thinking about how you're going to embed restorative justice and restorative practices. But yeah, there's not a clear step A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So that makes it difficult, right? Time. It is time intensive, because again, you're spending a lot of time doing community building stuff. Even if you're doing individual conferences, it may take multiple meetings to meet with individuals in what we would call pre-conferences before you actually get the people together. Resources in terms of training, ongoing kind of facilitator practice, having, to kind of sell the idea of restorative justice to the campus and the campus community, reorienting people's ideas of what justice looks like, what accountability looks like, recognizing that, this isn't a kumbaya process, which I think is one of the things that people often talk about, is that it's this really soft thing. And I don't know about y'all, but the last time, people, when you think about how hard it is for people to actually apologize and to actually own how they have hurt and impacted another person is actually really difficult work. And it's an emotional work that some people would rather just give me a fine or just give me, community service, right? Rather than actually having to do that emotional and kind of spiritual work. Again, experience like being engaged in this process and a practice, right, incongruent with your values. So you may say one thing, but it doesn't necessarily happen at the institutional level because of other things that are dictating that, this has to happen and this has to happen. So our policy says this, but we can't actually do this. On paper, we have to do this, and that's incongruent with what we want to do with restorative justice, right? The process can be co-opted, which is in my book chapter. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but that it doesn't really get facilitated the way it should because some people are telling, you got to do it this way, you got to do it this way, but they're missing some of those key elements. And honestly, it could perpetuate further harm if the facilitators are not really prepared to really do that deep unpacking with the individuals and, maybe rush to bring people together, but then it causes more harm, right? So those are just some of the things to think about when it comes to restorative justice. So just kind of threw a lot at you, a lot of different stuff. Again, it's really hard to talk about all that is restorative justice in around 30-ish minutes. But what's next for you? What questions do you still have? What are the things that are still either concerns or things that I didn't address that you want to get further clarification on, et cetera? If you need to type in your answer, you can just unmute yourself and ask. So how should students go about choosing facilitators? Well, obviously people have to, get some training in what exactly is restorative justice. But I think when it comes to facilitation, beyond that is thinking about who's a good facilitator in general, right? And then having them do some of that restorative work, but also keeping in mind the kind of social identities of people. So if you're doing things based off of harm around perhaps a racialized incident, you may want to consider that your facilitators may need to match the people impacted, right? Not always, but there might be some need to have perhaps co-facilitators, one facilitator who maybe perhaps is a Black Indigenous person of color, and maybe perhaps one person who's a white person, right? If it's around an incident of race involving a white person and a non-white person, right? So those are the types of things you might consider in facilitation. And I would say everybody can get involved in the restorative process, but I always intend not everybody should be a facilitator. Some people they're not good at facilitating. And also if you don't have particular knowledge about the incident that, that's going to be addressed in that, perhaps, this is again with conferences. When it comes to community building circle processes, really thinking about who can hold space, who can read the room, who can pick up on body language to make adjustments. In that space, it's a lot harder, obviously, in the virtual world if you're doing that, because you can't really read the room as well because people have their cameras off or things like that. You're I have no idea how people are feeling or doing in this moment. Right. So those are things to consider. How to go about making RJ Circle in a college setting. Really it's kind of just starting. And so thinking about, but what does a circle mean? So are you talking about an ongoing circle? So picking a particular community of people that you're going to be working with ongoing, or just we're just going to have an open space and see who shows up and then do it. So it really depends on what it is specifically that you want in terms of a circle. So it could be something you do in your residence hall. You can have ongoing circle processes that happen there. We at St. Mary's did use circle processes to actually do roommate agreements between suites. Doing it in that circle process there as a way of kind of building it in. We started doing it in seminars. So all students have to take seminar each of their 4 years at St. Mary's. So we piloted in a couple different programs where they do circle practices at the start of every single class in a handful of classes to do that. right? And so they start again getting in circle. We did it with some student athlete groups. So I worked with our baseball team when I was at St. Mary's, and I each of their Monday meetings, I met with them and we did circle processes at the start of their Monday night meetings. So you can really get it anywhere. I think it's finding a particular community that maybe you can start with and just building it from there. And as it works in, and thinking about, what's the next community we can enter into. And then as people kind of get used to it, then you can start thinking about how you might use circle processes to address a particular incident or particular climate. So you might do something around kind of just the political climate that's around, whatever, or something happens in your community, you can engage in circle processes. We did that. I was only at the institution at UNO for like a month. And we had some stuff happen on our social app. And so we did some circle processes to address the incidents. We just invited whoever wanted to participate. We set some ground rules for participating. We used the talking piece to get people to kind of share just how they're feeling, and walk through those different steps of, how do we build kind of the connection of why we're all here, how people are showing up, how do their social identities impact perhaps how they're perceiving the incident. Okay, now what is it that you're recognizing has happened? How did you feel about the incident? Okay, what do you need from us as an institution? What do you need from each other? How do you hold each other accountable for this kind of going forward? And then like, what do you all want to do as a collective group who are participating in a circle outside of the circle space? Yeah, so I sort of talked about one thing. Yes, Catherine, give me one second. Let me just address this one real quick around the historical harm. So what I was just talking about there, using circles for that, but I think particularly around historical harm, that definitely has to be something that is an ongoing process. It is not going to be done in a one-time circle. It is not going to be something that is done in even a one-time like conferencing process, because as you all recognize, understanding historical harm means you have to do a lot of unpacking of understanding history, right, and how we got here. Like when people talk about something being systemic, like a systemic issue, you have to understand what a system is, right? So you have to do some time really unpacking a lot of that there. Yes, Catherine.
I was just going to say, taking off on what you've said, Desiree, if students are interested in doing circles, I would say kind of walk a line between, maybe you don't have to get a student who's gone through a full facilitation process, but at least come to maybe a circle practice. We're going to do one next Friday, understand sort of what the process is, and then we can give some cheat sheets if students kind of want to work off of that. But I want to make sure people kind of experience what it's like actually doing a circle, and then maybe taking off from there. So I don't want to, I think, Desiree, you're doing a great job of reminding people that there's a real practice to this, and you want to make sure we're not causing harms. But I want to encourage people to start using these practices. But I would just say, really try to do something with a facilitation, with somebody who's done this as a facilitator before, and then you can think about how you might incorporate that. And we have, I think I said this, we have cheat sheets I'd be happy to share, and that can kind of help you checklist, like, we establish community agreements, we have our talking piece, we do these 5 things that really bring us into this space.
Yeah, I think I saw another hand. Alex Medina.
Yeah, I have a quick question. I was going to ask if what are some ways like restorative justice can be institutionalized and as like something accessible for all members of like a college community, and then along with that, kind of would that be something that should be done, or should it be more of like something that happens organically when a situation comes up?
Yes. So I think I think I would love for restorative justice to be institutionalized everywhere. I saw a comment that, it should be in like K-12, right? So in Orleans Parish, here where I'm at, a lot of the K-12 schools use circle practices. And so I think one way that it can be kind of like institutionalized, one obviously is through in your policy, through like your student conduct office, as an alternative resolution option that could exist for a number of policy violations. So some people use circle processes to address like level, like, or low level, or first time alcohol offenses or first time drug offenses. We could institute it. You know, we're starting to see some institutions using it to address sexual violence, sexual misconduct. Very careful about how you, again, implement that, put that into practice. You can use it, as I just talked about, thinking about starting with like roommate agreement processes. So again, getting people in the habit of being a circle, using it in classrooms, using it, I think, kind of pre-formed groups. So working with student clubs and organizations to use circle processes in their clubs and meetings. So I think there's ways to kind of have it kind of embedded that's perhaps not institutionalized in terms of like in policy and practice, but it is institutionalized or by policy and procedure, but it's institutionalized in terms of practice. And then there, you asked the second part of the question, and that answer was yes, but I don't remember now what the question was. Oh, yes, for individual incidents. Yeah, I mean, yes, I think as people get used to being in the practice of being in circle, then it becomes a lot easier then to get people back into like the practice of to being in a circle to address a particular incident. So again, so back at St. Mary's, one of the things, you know, we had been doing a little bit of that circle practice in some of our residence halls, and then we had like when the 2016 election was coming around, lots of things were happening on our campus, and so we had some circle processes to just kind of allow people to kind of share how they were feeling about what was going on our campus during that election. And then we had some, and then we did some caucusing kind of stuff. So we had like one that was specific for students of color and something for our white students. And we also had stuff for like our faculty. And then we had something that was kind of broad for students. We had a couple of different circles happening depending on what we kind of saw as a need. Yeah. And then, yeah, I think to Catherine's point, like, right, particularly something for circle processes, I think you don't have to have as much experience there, but you want to make sure you're still able to kind of pick up what's happening in the room. You're able to kind of refocus or reshift, perhaps if someone is kind of taking you off somewhere you perhaps don't need to go, or being able to figure out how you can still hold space, as you saw in the video where they were supposed to be talking about one incident, but then as a result of someone sharing, the conversation went another direction. How comfortable are you being able to still manage that space if the conversation shifts somewhere else? It doesn't mean you have to shift it back, but are you comfortable with it going somewhere else? So I think circles is definitely a great place to start. And again, it gets people being in the habit of being vulnerable, which is what you ultimately need people to do to really address and understand impact and harm. We can talk about building community university. Like how does one become an artist? So there's not a certification, which is why I think this is like the complicated kind of process for restorative justice. I think there's been some training opportunities, some good, some not so good. It really depends. I think really any person can be a facilitator. What I think you have to do, of course, is really spending time recognizing how you show up as a facilitator. Right, there's lots of scripts and stuff like that that's out there. And so when we do the circle, April the 9th, that's the correct date, right? I just go where my calendar tells me to go. I will provide like a script for people. And I'm sure that there's some scripts that already exist as well, that you can kind of just follow along. And I think as you practice it more, it's really about practice. The more you practice being a facilitator and facilitating, then you pick up on kind of your own tics and kind of your own things that like make you as a facilitator, and like where do you need to spend some more time practicing. So whether it is again picking up on, you know, the nuance of other people's languages, or you know, managing the space. But for the most part, the way that the scripts are designed is that you don't really have to do a lot as a facilitator. You just really need to be attentive to the people in the space. And so often try to have a co-facilitator as well. Because through that co-facilitation, then perhaps they're picking up on something you're not picking up, or if someone needs to step up out of the room because something happened in the space, one facilitator can go address that individual person's needs while the other person stays in the room and keeps things going and flowing. But there are lots of trainings that are out there. There will be some this summer through ACPA, I just saw. Yeah. Maria.
I was gonna add that we've done iterations of more of a listening session versus, but borrowing from restorative justice practice last fall. And, we offered them to the campus. Paula got like a quick crash course from me on how to be my partner in facilitation. And obviously it's different when you're in a virtual setting to do that. But, the intention is to offer those. We also offered one. We did one, was it 3 weeks ago, Paula? 2 weeks ago, in response to Atlanta, or a week and a half ago, in response to Atlanta. And we actually had some students that attended that.
Great.
And Catherine and I, since we arrived at Hamilton, have been talking about how we can fold RJ into the bias incident response process and all of that. And that's where we met Desiree last February before the world shut down.
And I'm almost done actually creating a couple of scripts, particularly around bias related stuff. So I'll be happy to share with that. I got a couple people checking in, reviewing it, other stuff. So I'm hoping to be able to get that out to people soon.
Thank you. Yeah, Catherine and I are very much about trying to figure out how we can fold that into the work in the Dean of Students office. And, if COVID would not have happened, we would have sent folks in residence life to go to the training that San Diego was doing last summer. That was slated for last summer, to figure out how we can fold it into our residence hall component. So I think somebody had asked, I don't know if it was someone had asked in process, on the side, or maybe Paul, it was a comment that you made about using RJ to set up roommate agreements and things of that nature. But, there's plenty of institutions, and a lot of them are in California, that's just practice, right? I think, we had a colleague in our training in February who talked about how her residents just get in circle. I think, would just say like, let's get in circle. We are getting in circle. Like a suite would just be like, get in circle, and they would do it on their own, because it's become just natural response to how to address, issues.
And that was the thing that solidified for me. I was doing observational work at a high school, and two students were literally about to get into a physical fight. Like a girl like pulled her arm up and then took a deep breath and was like, "We need a circle." And I was like, "What?" And she was like, "Go get me," and told the other girl. Another girl was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna go get Mr. Evans." And she went and got Mr. Evans, and Mr. Evans got they have a floating teacher who's always just available when other teachers are in school for these types of things. And the floating teacher, because that's the teacher that they trusted, Mr. Evans. So Mr. Evans got the floating teacher. They went in the classroom, and then Mr. Evans took them and went and did, their process, because they do circle processes every single day at their school. They do it in their advisories, they do it, right? And so they're the more you're engaged in the process regularly, the easier it is to kind of circle yourself up, right? It becomes something you do. You're like, why would we do this any other way? Why? When we have this method.
Well, and Desiree, I think that really brings home how you're saying there's just like no one model. There's the kind of suffusing it as a community-based thing so that people are on their own deciding to get into circle, which means they're really trying to work things out with each other rather than just being like a strict accountability, like I'm right, you're wrong type of situation. I think there's also a lot of community building that can be done in circle, which is very important. I would just caution, like, if you're not self-starting that circle with your own practice to address your own harm, I would not encourage anyone to appoint themselves a facilitator for someone else's harm. I think if we're really addressing a harm between individuals or people, that should be done really intentionally and over time, and with somebody who's had a lot of experience in that. But we're hoping to bring in all of these elements.
And I think you can also start introducing people to doing it, depending on what your orientation processes look like, right? Other institutions, and that's something we're hoping to do. That we were originally going to try to do it this summer, and then, just that little thing called COVID happened. But and then now we're kind of in this in between where we're working back and forth. So we probably still won't do it this summer, but be working with like our orientation leaders to do, so they'll, you know, doing circle processes after they, you know, so we have the sexual misconduct, you know, kind of presentation that happens during orientation. We're going to do a circle process afterwards to actually flesh out what they just experienced through that process, right? They're going to do some caucusing that they're doing during orientation. Well, after that, going to do some circle processes kind of after that, right? So there's different ways. So again, we're not gonna call it restorative justice, right? Because it's not really the full thing, but they're being in circle and they're used to get, we ran the circle thing. And so then when we do talk about restorative justice down the line, oh, well, do you remember when you did that circle thing during orientation? Oh, do you remember when you did that circle thing during your roommate agreement process? Do you remember when you did that circle thing? So we're just going to be doing that same thing. We're just going to do it. And they're like, oh yeah, I could do that, right? And so again, they're doing it and they don't realize, just like most of us have done stuff that has been restorative throughout our lives, we just didn't have the language for it yet, right? So it's the same way. We're introducing them to restorative processes. We're just not using that language yet until we get further and deeper kind of into the culture and into the practice. And then we can kind of put a name on it because you're connecting all of the different pieces. So this piece, this piece, this piece, and this piece together is restorative justice. I recognize the time. I'm comfortable staying a little longer, but I know other people maybe perhaps need to go, but I'm more than happy to answer any other questions that people have.
If I may ask you a question before anyone has to sign off,
sure.
Can you go over what we could expect from signing up for Circle so that we may share with friends, like, hey, this is what Circle is and this is how we should, you know, the April 9th session?
Yeah. So I would say, okay, I'm like, how do I succinctly describe that, right? So I think the circle process really is going to be about building a community around, I'm like, what did we decide to talk about? Around, I'm like, Gather, what did we decide to talk about?
We're going with, well, people discussing what accountability means to them. We might develop
an
understanding of that.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So yeah, so I think I'd say what we expect is that we're going to be developing community around a sense of accountability, and so thinking about what does it mean to develop accountability for ourselves, but then also with people around us, and that process includes, right, building relationships with the people in that circle, even if it can seem, perhaps you don't want to use superficial. Don't say that word. Because it's not, it's deeper than that, but it can feel like it in the moment until after the fact that you've done some reflective work. So building community around a sense of accountability is like the little sentence thingy. I think the elevator speech is that, you know, a circle process really is about creating equitable voices for people to share their experiences around, you know, accountability in this context.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Anderson, for coming to speak to us. And I'm really excited about the April 9th event. So yeah, I just wanted to wish you thank you again and wish everyone a good night.
Awesome. Thank you so much.